My guest this lunchtime is Dr. Michael Spence. In a moment, I'll introduce him to you, but please, as I say, if you are just joining, please use the chat function to put questions that you'd like to ask Dr. Spence a little later on, and we'll try and field as many of those as we can in the time available to us. Let me now introduce our guest. Dr. Spence is the President and Provost of UCL, one of the world's leading universities. He's recognised internationally as a leader in the field of intellectual property theory and holds a Doctor of Philosophy from the University of Oxford, where he headed the Law Faculty and Social Sciences Division. Following his time in Oxford, in 2008, Dr. Spence returned to Australia, where he held the position of Vice-Chancellor of the University of Sydney for over 12 years. And in that role, he was responsible for raising a record $1 billion Australian dollars through the Inspired Philanthropic campaign, the largest campaign of its type in Australian history. And in 2017, he was awarded the Companion of Order, one of Australia's highest honours for his services to education. Dr. Spence is a Christian. He's married with 8 children. And in 2022, 1 year after his appointment as Provost at UCL, he became Chair of Mercyship's UK's Board of Trustees. Michael, we are delighted to have you with us this lunchtime.
Thanks
Thank
very
you
much.
for joining us. I've got a bunch of questions. I'd love to ask you to get the conversation rolling. And then afterwards, in about 20 minutes time, we'll open for some questions. And again, if you're just joining us, please use the chat function to field your questions. We'll take as many of those as we can. Michael, can I begin by asking you to tell us a little bit about the young Michael Spence? What were your hopes and your aspirations growing up?
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can remember my hopes and aspirations. I suppose, like most young people, I was just interested in lots of things. One thing I didn't imagine that I would be doing at this age is my current job, which is a bizarre combination of being chief executive of an almost £2 billion turnover organisation, being chief worker in a workers' collective. Only 20 of my colleagues have to sign a petition for me to have a meeting of 1,700 of my colleagues within 2 weeks. Being headmaster at big school, I've spoken at student funeral and do graduations and things, and also mayor of a small town. There are 257 buildings that UCL has across London. So it's a whatever it was that the young Michael Spence wanted to be, it was a current job. So.
Thank you, Michael. You attended the University of Sydney, where you graduated with a Bachelor of Arts in English and Italian, and then with a Bachelor of Laws. Slightly provocatively, having done those different subjects, which has been the most influential and helpful to you, and why?
Yeah, so I've since done degrees in theology and Korean too. So and the Korean's useful because we use that at home. The theology is useful because it helps me think about life. But the law is great because it really it gives you a structured way to think about problems. And it's been really fun to teach law for much of my career, and to watch students develop the skills of a lawyer to parse problems, to identify what questions might be relevant, to look for evidence to back their arguments. Those core skills of a lawyer, I think, are pretty useful.
You still find yourself using those core skills in your job today?
Yeah, I do, all the time. Very much.
So in 2008, you returned to Australia to take up the post of Vice-Chancellor and Principal at the University of Sydney. Mm-hmm. Again, we've got limited time, but tell us about some of the high and low points of that chapter in your life, and what was the most helpful advice that you received during that period?
So Sydney is a marvelous, chaotic, enormous institution, about 73,000 students and so comprehensive that at one point I said to our marketing people, let's make the claim it's the most comprehensive university in the world. And they said, well, we gave up at the top 200, but we can certainly say it's the most comprehensive in the top 200, taught everything from astrophysics to jewelry making and trained everybody from veterinary nurses through, to physicists. And so it was an enormously fun job. It was also the civic university. It was the university of the city. Although there are others in the city, it was the one that 5 million people in the city loved to bits, and 3 million people were sure that they could run better than the people who were paid to do it. And the editor of the Sydney Morning Herald once said, Michael, you should know that when the words the University of Sydney appear in an online article in a headline, our advertising revenue goes up, and we thought it was an exhaustible resource, but it was an inexhaustible resource. So expect to be in the newspaper or on the telly or in the radio just about every day. And that made it an interesting management environment, because if you were a disgruntled lecturer in French, it was much easier to go to the Sydney Morning Herald than it was to talk to your line manager. And that was a particular kind of challenge, different to the challenges of UCL, but a lot of fun. I suppose the low in that period in my life was it was in that period of my life that my first wife, who is American, passed away, and she was only ill for a month before she died, and so that was definitely the low. And I suppose what I learned in that process was that I'm not God. That doesn't sound like a very profound thing to learn, but one of the problems of having positions of responsibility of one kind or another, whether or not it's in a family or in a workplace or whatever, is that you can come, particularly if you're a fixer, to think that you can sort most things. And then you encounter this moment in your life that you realize you just can't fix. And that was a good thing to learn. And I think probably shifted some of the ways that I did the rest of my life.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And I think many of the lawyers on this call this lunchtime will resonate with that feeling that very often lawyers try to be fixers, don't they?
Yeah, exactly.
And we realise there's some things we can't fix, and
it's the training. I can sort out the problem. I can work out what should happen here. I can negotiate my way out of this.
Yeah.
And there's lots of things you just can't negotiate your way out of.
Yeah, yeah. About 3 years ago, you returned to the United Kingdom to take up the role of President and Provost of UCL. What was it like returning to the UK, and what differences did you notice between the university system in Australia and that which you returned to in the UK?
Yeah, so there are differences, and I often think that the differences between the English language speaking cultures are underestimated. But it is, I was talking to a former High Commissioner to Australia from Britain yesterday, and he said of all his international moves, including a move to Washington, the move to Canberra was by far and away the easiest, because there is a real resonance between the cultures and systems of the two countries. And in fact, in the higher education system, they face very similar challenges. UCL is a similar institution to the University of Sydney, founded in the first half of the 19th century as a sort of great secular liberal institution to be a comprehensive university. So yeah, it wasn't too difficult to transition in work terms.
And in personal terms, moving back?
In personal terms, it was a lot of fun, because we live right in the middle of London, and London is an extraordinary city. And while I'd lived for 20 years in Oxford, Oxford is a pretty sleepy town, and to have the resources of this sort of remarkable, multicultural, dynamic city at your doorstep has been a great joy.
Right, thank you. Universities are clearly very key to the formation of the next generation of leaders. When you think about the character of the next generation of leaders? What characteristics do you see prioritized and promoted by our leading universities, and which of those do you hope will prevail, and why?
Yeah, so universities talk a lot about leadership formation, and of course they all have some sort of special leadership preparation course and all the rest of it. But I think much more important are the tacit messages that are sent to students about what leadership looks like. And I think there are two that are strong in our culture and that universities don't do much to combat, that are in one way or another are problematic. The first is that, you know, academics are professionally disagreeable. That's the way we make our name. We're essentially sole traders flogging our own academic reputation. And the way the argument goes is, you know, you've heard it said that X is true, but verily, verily, I say unto you, X is not true, Y is true, and that's why you should give me a promotion or a Nobel Prize. And that process of, and in some ways it's a really good process, but that process of strong conviction that leads to strong conviction and to the notion that I'm right about this particular thing, can make students forget that the world is a complex place. Yeah. It can make them assume that there is a right answer, and that if you just have enough conviction about what the right answer is, that's a good leadership thing. The other thing is, we, particularly in an institution like UCL, we celebrate achievement. And again, that's a good thing. There's absolutely no doubt about that. In fact, our motto from book 5 of the Aeneid more or less says it's a good thing to celebrate hard work and success. And that's right too. But it can lead to the impression that a leader is a person who is always out the front, right, and achieving things. And that's tough in a world that is broken, and in a world that doesn't always go right, and in a world where being an able leader is partly about recognizing your own brokenness and being able to deal with the brokenness of others in ways that are creative, fair, and thoughtful, but not, I'm right, we're going to do this, let's get out there, we can achieve it, always out in front of the troops, in the kind of way that leadership is sometimes modeled in universities.
And how possible is it to teach that kind of approach, a humbler approach to leadership and to formation of character?
Yeah, so we're working on that quite hard at the moment at UCL. UCL was founded with a very distinctive ethos. First, with an ethos for useful knowledge, not the polite learning of Oxford and Cambridge, as they said. And that doesn't mean that we don't do, you know, research into the characteristics of geometric shapes in the 36th dimension or whatever it might be. But it does mean that we do our work with a purpose, which is a particular purpose of service for the community. But perhaps even more characteristically, to go to university at the time at which UCL was founded, you had to sign the 39 Articles of the Church of England to go to Oxford or Cambridge. And the notion was that to live together well in community, you had to all think the same thing. UCL was founded on the very radical notion that you could think really quite different things. You could not only not agree, but you could radically disagree, and you could live well together in community. And we're trying to recover what that means for a university. You know, what does diversity look like for a university? How do you curate for pluralism? If you have a Buddhist Marxist sociologist and a disabled Marxist sociologist and a woman Marxist sociologist? And do you have diversity in a meaningful sense for a sociology department? How do you avoid the narcissistic process of self-reproduction, which is much academic hiring? How do you, what are a teacher's duties in the classroom to the position with which she most disagrees? And if you curate for pluralism and you therefore have in a university community people who think really quite different things, how do you disagree, and how do you talk across difference? And talking across difference is an essential skill. I'm just now name dropping, had Romano Prodi in my office, and he was talking about the importance at the moment of international leaders being able to talk across difference. If that requires a certain epistemic humility, that requires the capacity to say, well, I might be wrong, and therefore it's worth listening to what you have to say. And even if I have deep convictions, the way in which I am going to engage with you is a way that suggests that I might have something to learn. And that is something that we are consciously thinking, both in our public engagement and our engagement with staff, but also particularly with our students, how you teach that skill, how you teach a particular kind of epistemic humility that recognizes the brokenness and complexity of the world, that recognizes you might be wrong, that nevertheless has conviction and can speak across difference. How do you disagree well, in other words? And I think that's a pretty essential leadership requirement.
Yeah, I agree. And the Disagreeing Well campaign that UCL has been running, how successful has that been to date? How have you seen it worked out in practice?
Well, it's a really tricky thing to measure the success of. One, universities are communities of discourse, and one thing that I would measure as a sign of its success is that people are increasingly, HLA Hart talks about the normative force of law as being the fact that people use rules as standards for their own or other people's behavior. And I think in the same kind of way, people have been increasingly using the language of disagreeing well to check the behaviors of others and to reflect on their own behavior. And I know that because when I get grumpy letters complaining about X or Y or Z and things I've done, people will allude to the disagreeing well language. And we have seen in some areas a sort of shift in the culture that is that there are various more and less bogus ways of measuring, but that we think is making a difference. Certainly, we know there's an appetite for this conversation in the public at large. Last night, we had the latest in our Disagreeing Well public engagement events. We closed registrations at 1,000 in the venue and 700 online. So people want to talk about what it means to see a different kind of leadership, a leadership of conviction, but nevertheless a leadership that is open to the complexity of working in diverse environments and of leading diverse communities.
Yeah, that's encouraging. Michael, you're open about your Christian faith. To be a Christian is to be a follower of Jesus, a labourer from Nazareth. That may seem like a surprising leader for someone in your position. What do you find so compelling about Jesus Christ?
So I always find this a tricky question, because it's a bit like saying, what do you love about your wife? And I could list lots of things that I love about my wife, but any one of them would seem reductionist, because my wife is a person, and the Jesus that you encounter in the Gospels is a complex, demanding, inspiring, real person.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to say one thing or another. I suppose carrying on the thing that I find deeply compelling in the story of Jesus is the cross and resurrection. It's the notion that the power that created and is at the center of the universe is a kind of self-giving love, and that self-giving love is ultimately undefeatable.
Yeah.
And that challenges me to think about leadership, because I think it not only has to be not open to listening and not always sure that it's right, and not always out in front, and not always achievement oriented, but also ultimately not about itself, but about the people that it serves. And the cross of Jesus says to me, this is how far God went to serve the world he loves. What does that ask of me in relation to my service for the communities of which I'm a part? And I'm as damaged and selfish as the next bloke, and I won't say that that I score particularly highly on this front, but I hope having that vision of the cross of Jesus makes a difference to the way that I try and engage in leadership in my day job.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. A related question is, it ties back in with the topic of disagreeing. One is, as we look at the world in which we live, thinking about London, for instance, we live in very diverse, wonderfully rich, ethnically rich places. And in London, when we think about diversity, equality, and inclusion, both in the workplace and in wider society, how does your Christian worldview inform your leadership at UCL to matters of diversity, equality, and inclusion?
Yeah, I mean, I think so if you're committed to the notion of a creator God, the glorious lavishness of creation, the diversity of creation, suggests that diversity is something that he values. And it is also the case that in the Christian story, he sets creation free to, as it were, in dialogue with him, gives people the capacity for choice, and that's something he respects. And I think it is important that we recognize that people are different, that they have different histories, that they have different values, and find a way of living well with and benefiting from that difference. And I suppose I think that particularly as somebody who has as someone who is a part of an epistemic minority, Christianity was foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews, according to the Apostle Paul, and now it is by any measure weird on almost all the assumptions of our culture. And I want people to make space for me and my beliefs on campus, and so I have to know how to make space for other people and their beliefs, and I have to do that genuinely and not in a tokenistic way. So, diversity is about genuinely letting everybody be themselves on campus. It's no good saying, for example, oh, isn't it marvelous that we have all these conservative Muslim students on campus, because that ticks the BAME box, but they better not say what they think about human sexual ethics, because that would cross the LGBTQ box. We've got to find a way where everybody can be themselves. And I would like to think that my understanding of the space that God has created for us to make choices gives me a theological framework for thinking about that.
Thank you, Michael. We've got a few questions in the chat. I'll take a few of those if I can. Now, please do use the chat if you want to field any questions to Michael. The first one's from Dominic Hughes in London, who asks, what lessons have you drawn from leaders in the Bible, such as Moses, Nehemiah, Daniel, and the like, who led people in difficult times?
So my Jesus aside, my favorite character in the Bible is Abraham, because he kind of wanders around for decades and decades, not getting it right most of the time, and then occasionally he has these bizarre religious experiences, then he wanders around a bit more. I suppose what I learned from that is that even when the situation is incredibly complex, God is there, and that when my temptation is to say, leave it to me, I should be on my knees, in the kind of old adage. And so I find Abraham particularly inspiring in that way.
Another question here, perhaps I can join up two questions actually. One is from Tatiana, who asks, what are your hopes and aspirations for the upcoming generation? And then link that in with one from Zion, who says, what advice would you give to young people starting out in the legal field?
Yeah, so there's a huge amount of pressure on young people at the moment to achieve in all sorts of ways. And I think the advice I would give is, remember life is long and it takes many unexpected turns. And I suppose you most see this talking to students about what they're going to do when they leave university. Almost every 21-year-old who is leaving university is fixed on what they're going to do when they're 65. And of course, they have no idea what they're going to do when they're 65. The really important question is, what are they going to do for the next 3 years? And is it something that has purpose for them and more broadly? And is it something that they'll enjoy? And so I think my advice to young people is always to remember that life is long, that it takes many unexpected turns, and that it's much less like a railway track to a destination, and much more like weaving a story as things happen and as opportunities arise. And the question is, as you weave that story, what story are you telling? Is it a story? Is it a story about love, really? And is it a story about love for God and love for other people? And that's probably my hopes and aspirations for the next generation. I think the I'm not like Socrates. You know, there's the famous passage where Socrates says the whole problem of the world is young people today. I'm not like him. I am daily inspired by the young people with whom I work. And I think there are lots of challenges that we are facing, geopolitical challenges and challenges with the climate and challenges in social change. And I am always impressed by the optimism and commitment to make a difference amongst the young people with whom I work.
Mm. Oh, that's a beautiful way of expressing hope as well. And I wonder, like, as somebody who's in a leadership position, he's very much working with the next generation of thought leaders and so on for our societies. Whether you feel hopeful, Michael, are you a hopeful person?
I am hopeful. I am hopeful. I mean, I think that's for me, there are two big questions you got to know the answer to. The first is life a comedy or a tragedy? You know, is Beckett right? They give life astride a grave, the light gleams an instant, and then it's night once more, which is a completely plausible way of looking at the world. Or is our intuition that there is a purpose to things, that there is a reason to have hope, that life is a comedy? Is it justified? And if it's justified, you've got to know why it's justified. And I would say it's justified because the resurrection of Jesus gives us a guarantee that God is doing something about the suffering in the world. So in that sense, I'm hopeful. I suppose the other big question is a related one, which is a question about the nature of suffering. And again, you either do three things with suffering, right? You either say, well, life is what it is, what it is, what it is. And there's no difference between me and a stone. We're just a different arrangement of atoms. And then you've got to accept that suffering is kind of meaningless. Or you say, in line with many of the Eastern religions, you know, suffering is the complement of not suffering, life the complement of death, illness the complement of wellness, and so on, and that there's a kind of pattern to things, but it's a pattern of complementarity. And my problem with that way of looking at things is, you know, my late wife's father has just died, and even when an old person dies, you have a sense that it's not right. And my sense of this kind of my problem with this kind of complementary view of good and evil, of suffering and not suffering, is that it doesn't account for that intuition that we have that things are not right. So then you can say, well, actually, beauty, truth, and goodness, they're somehow more authentic, they're more real than ugliness, lies, and evil. And ugliness and lies and evil are not things; they're the kind of broken version of goodness, truth, and beauty. And that somehow it's possible for those things to win in the end. And I mean, that's essentially the Christian vision. And it's why I have hope.
Yeah. And that ties in some way with Chorley's question about the second coming of Jesus. One of the key Christian doctrines is about the second coming of Jesus Christ. And I wonder to what extent, Michael, that doctrine is something you found helpful as you see the complexity of issues in life.
So I think that the well-attested resurrection of Jesus, without which it is very hard to explain the rise of early Christianity, gives me hope that in some way the show is not merely circular, but that it will in some way be wrapped up, and that that life will win in the end.
Yeah.
And yeah, that gives me hope.
Thank you, Michael. Janice has asked a great question. So the Lawyers Christian Fellowship began as a prayer union in 1852. We say at the LCF that prayers where lawyers do their best work. And Janice has asked, how should prayer feature in the life of a good Christian leader?
So I was, when I was head of social sciences at Oxford, I took over from a dear friend who used to, at the beginning of every academic year, take as well as kind of praying, obviously, on the way through, take a day away on university time to pray for the business of the division. And at his retirement event, someone, a head of one of the departments in the division who wasn't a Christian, in fact, had serious problems with Christianity, said that this person was the best advertisement, was almost a reason for becoming a Christian, because there was a qualitative difference about their leadership. And I think in prayer, God forms us. Prayer should be an essential part of the leadership framing. I would love to say it is for me in reflection and meditation, and not merely in desperation, but it is more often in desperation than it is in reflection and meditation. But I think I'd be a better leader if it were the other way around.
Thank you, Michael. And a question here from Alan, a question from Dr. Spence. What would you say is the biggest challenge for university leaders in the UK at the moment, or over the next few years? Is there a particular challenge that stands out as requiring good leadership, or else failure, catastrophe could result?
Yeah, so we're ranked 9th in the world. On average, the top 20 have a $20 billion endowment. Our endowment is smaller than that of Balliol College. Like many universities, we are student fee funded. Domestic student fees don't cover the cost of teaching home students. And with every research grant you get, you lose money because you don't get all the direct, and you certainly don't get all the indirect costs. You don't get anything for the 40% of people's time that they spend researching in any case. We are an international student education business that, by running our international student education business, supports home education and research. That is a pretty precarious financial model. And in fact, it is claimed, and I don't know because but it is claimed that 40% of 40 British universities this year will declare a deficit. And universities have kind of patched and sewn to make things work, and not repaired their buildings. We have about £200 million of backlog compliance required backlog repairs and maintenance, and so on, and being mean to not paid enough and all sorts of things. But it is getting to a bit of a crunch point. Good leadership in this context is going to involve helping institutions think about what's really important and worth preserving, and what are the nice to-dos that that perhaps they can no longer afford to do. And that's hard because universities, like churches, are places where people are vocationally engaged. They're engaged not just to make a buck. In fact, if they wanted to make a buck, they probably wouldn't work in a university. They have a strong purpose to their work and therefore are passionate about their work. And so good leadership in an increasingly resource-constrained environment is going to involve asking and helping the community to answer questions about what's really important about the work of the university and what the university can stop doing. And I think that will require a particular kind of leadership. And I think if you are the kind of leader that I talked at the beginning that says, I know the answer about this before I've had the conversation, and I'm 5 miles out ahead, and this is why I'm going to be remembered as the best Vice-Chancellor in the history of the UK. You're almost certainly bound to fail. If you're the kind of leader that says, well, I don't know the answer, but perhaps we can work it out together. And then as you work it out together, make sure that the conversation is robust and evidence-based and transparent, and then when decisions are made, that they're followed through. I think that's the kind of leadership that's going to be required over the next little while.
Thank you. Well, 2 final questions from myself to close with. If you could speak to the young Michael Spence at the start of his academic career, what advice would you give to him?
I'm not very good at looking back. I think I would say I can tell you the most important training for my current job, and I think this is what I'd say, and it's probably it's what I quite often say to young people. I used to work in a 24-hour restaurant, and in the 24-hour restaurant, and I worked the 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. shift. Wow. And we you'd go into the kitchen and you'd grab any name badge and you'd wear it. And it was great because when some drunk person was saying to you at 4 o'clock in the morning, "Listen, Neil," you'd think, well, you're not being horrible to me. My name's Michael. You're being horrible to some dumbwaiter called Neil. You have no idea who I am. You are being horrible to the function. I am a person. And everybody has strong ideas about what the Vice-Chancellor should do or shouldn't do, and how the Vice-Chancellor is destroying the place. In this job, you're always getting credit for things you didn't really do, and you're always getting the blame for things you didn't really do. And it's really important, whatever your job is, to be able to keep a distance, to have integrity in the role, but nevertheless to be able to keep a distance between the role and you. And I think that's true at whatever your job is. You've got to know what makes you important. That is not the role. And in highly demanding jobs like legal jobs where your time is measured in 6-minute units, or in highly pressured jobs like university leadership jobs where everybody is always telling you you're doing the wrong thing, it's way too easy to let your identity get mixed up with your professional identity. And I'd say keep those things separate. Remember that you are loved, and remember that you're valued, whatever Neil may be doing.
Great advice. And the last one, For members of the LCF, the Bible plays an important part in their everyday life, shaping the way we think, providing strength and encouragement in the ups and downs of life. Thinking about your current role and responsibilities and the challenges you're facing at the moment, is there a verse from Scripture which you find particularly helpful or instructive?
So many. And you know, work there was a period a little while ago when work was really tough. And I spent 6 months reading the 23rd Psalm. I read the 23rd Psalm every day. I read sermons on the 23rd Psalm. I read books on the 23rd Psalm, put together a playlist of music on the 23rd Psalm. And that strong vision of the God who is with us was incredibly important in keeping me going during that period. But I could talk about times when other bits of the Bible have been important to me. One thing that I think is one thing that I'd commend is that it really did help spending a lot of time in the same passage. You know, we can and like the psalmist says, meditating on your word day and night, rather than doing what I characteristically do, which is say, well, I've read my chapter, it's now 8 o'clock, I got to get the bus.
Yeah. And interestingly, a bit of plug here. This book here, The Lord of Psalm 23 by David.
That is what I didn't read.
Oh, it's excellent. Heartily recommend it. Just finished reading that, and it's an absolute delight. Jesus, our shepherd, companion, and host is the subtitle to that book. Michael, it's been an absolute joy talking with this lunchtime. Thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule and a busy day. I know it's a demanding day for you today, so thank you so much for that. It's been a delight to chat and an encouragement and inspiration to all of us here as well.